Hello, my name is Jack McCabe, and in this presentation, I'll be discussing the 1945 Labour Party Manifesto, Let Us Face the Future. I'll analyse the policies contained within the manifesto, its attitude towards the Conservative and Liberal parties, and the language used to get its arguments across. Finally, I'll look at why the Labour Party won the election in 1945. However, no manifesto can be seen in isolation. This document has to be viewed in the context of World War II and the poverty and mass unemployment of the interwar years, with the view at the time amongst some that the government wasn't doing enough to alleviate it. Think of the General March, or at the very least, it could do more. John Maynard Keynes, an economist at the time, argued that the main cause of mass unemployment was a reduction in demand, and the state could intervene in the economy to stimulate demand and thereby guarantee full employment. And it's this Keynesian framework which the Labour Party uses in its manifesto to pitch for full employment. The fact that the Labour Party are arguing for full employment in this manifesto doesn't distinguish it from the other parties. The Conservatives make a similar argument in their manifesto, arguing for full employment. However, theirs is in the context of a free market, low taxes, low regulation. What distinguishes the Labour Party from the other parties is how they're going to bring about full employment, the extent to which they're willing to intervene in the economy. They promise to take a control in hand in price control, wage control. Further, it plans to nationalise industries such as coal, gas, iron, steel. And according to Jonathan Schneer, writing in 1985, the Labour Party eventually took almost 20% of the British economy into state hands, and this is an unprecedented level of involvement of the state in the economy in peacetime British history. Another strand of the Labour Party's policies was the establishment of what became known as the welfare state. This has its basis in 1942 in the Beveridge Report, which proposed cradle-to-grave social care, extended coverage of pensions, unemployment benefits, free medical care, became the NHS. And even though this report's never mentioned by name in the manifesto, possibly because Beveridge was standing for election for the Liberal Party at the time, this is the basis of the policies proposed by Labour in this manifesto, and this becomes the basis of what becomes known as the welfare state, in order to protect against what the manifesto calls the mean and shabby treatment of the 1930s, once again reaching back to the interwar years. And the manifesto links together these three strands of policy in order to protect against the economic downturn and fund the new system of public welfare. The state has to provide for full employment, the taxes from which will fund the welfare state. And so in order to guarantee that full employment, the state has to intervene in the economy, which includes nationalisation and the wage and price controls. And all this is summed up by Michael Young, the man who drafted the manifesto, in an interview with Peter Hennessy. He described his intention with the manifesto as Keynes plus Beveridge plus socialism, and it's this neat little formula which helps sum up the manifesto. It's state-backed full employment plus the welfare state plus the nationalised industries, and it's this that forms the basis of the post-war consensus for the next 34 years. And this is what Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party dismantles after 1979. So we can see Clement Attlee's Labour government and Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government as bookends for the post-war consensus based around full employment and nationalised industries. And it's also in 1945 where the Labour Party views the Conservatives as their main electoral rivals, calls on progressives to support the party. It acknowledges the Liberal Party as fellow progressives, but it argues that the Labour Party is the only realistic alternative to the Tory Party. And this is a straightforward two-horse race. It calls Britain a country of two parties. And it's at this election, I'd argue, where that notion solidifies itself. It's a trend which reaches back to the time after the First World War, with the decline of the Liberal Party and the rise of the Labour Party gathers pace through the 1930s. It's at this election where the Labour Party established themselves as the only realistic alternatives to the Conservative Party. And when people talk about the two-party system in Britain. This is what they mean. This is where it begins at this election. And I just go on now to talk about how the party framed its message, despite the fact that the war in Europe has only recently finished and the war in Japan is still continuing. The manifesto is targeting an electorate concerned primarily with domestic issues. It discusses the international post-war settlement at the end of the document, which contrasts with the Conservative, who at the beginning of their document talk about foreign affairs and defence. And this, I think, suggests a difference between the parties in priorities and the perception of what the voters want, and it speaks to why the Labour Party were more successful than the Conservative Party. This manifesto talks to a country that wants to see material, tangible change at home. They understand that. The Conservatives not so much, and it uses the experiences of the war to get its message across almost from the outset. There's an appeal to the spirit of Dunkirk and the sacrifices of wartime, and just as the country is pulled together for victory in war, it can do so again in peacetime. The manifesto, once again, we go back to the end of the First World War, the poverty of the interwar years, the idea that there was a lost opportunity on the part of what it calls the anti-Labour parties to effect significant change in Britain. The implication being that Labour are the only party who can avoid making that mistake again. So all through the manifesto, the Labour Party contrasts the people pulling together selflessly in the national interest represented by the Labour Party, against the greedy and selfish private free enterprise. But the manifesto, it's also interesting for how it doesn't put its message across as for how it does. Herbert Morrison, who went on to become the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary after 1945, described the Labour Party's programme as applied common sense. This is how the manifesto comes across. It's not socialist rhetoric, although there are a couple of paragraphs asserting Labour's commitment to socialism and their ultimate goal of forming a socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain. There's no avowedly socialist rhetoric. There's no talk of the proletariat or the seizing the commanding height of the economy. The party, it presents its programme as a realistic, reasonable, rational response to the problems facing Britain in 1945, and it suggests the party successfully tapping into the mood of a country, and it's arranging its rhetoric accordingly. Now, Michael Young, who I mentioned earlier, in the same interview with Peter Hennessy, he thought that no matter what the Labour Party had put in this manifesto, they still would have won the election. Whilst I wouldn't go that far, I would question the influence any manifesto has on any general election result. However, this does serve to illustrate one strand in the historical analysis of why the Labour Party won this election. On the one hand, there's those such as Stephen Fielding, who in 1992 essentially argued that this was a negative election result. This was a defeat of the Conservatives, not a victory for the Labour Party. As a result of the binary nature of British politics in 1945, anyone who wanted to get rid of the Conservatives had to vote Labour. And he also placed special emphasis on the Conservative Party's lukewarm support for the Beveridge Report as a major factor in their loss of support. On the other hand, in 1984, Kenneth Morgan argued that the Labour Party identified with a change in mood in the country as a result of the experience of wartime, and it came to embody the spirit of change. I'd view the Labour Party victory in a similar manner to Morgan. Whilst there's undoubtedly a change of mood against the Conservatives during the war, Fielding mentions the number of by-elections the Conservative Party lost during World War II. You can perceive a direction of travel of the British electorate including the Beveridge Report, which the Labour Party harnesses successfully towards greater social provision and state involvement in the economy. And these come together in the election victory in 1945. So that's my presentation on the 1945 Labour Party Manifesto. Thanks for watching.